Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this week's discussion in community archives. So we'll be talking about collision courses. So looking at some of the ways in which traditional archival practice may differ from the practice of community archives, just to kind of continue looking at the differences between the two types of archives and discussing ways in which community archives can be more community-centric to sort of echo some previous discussions that we've had in this course. Okay, so here are our weekly topics. What are the implications for archival theory in community archives? How do community-centric perspectives threaten archival concepts? And what is the role of the archivist in community archives? And so, of course, that can be something that can create a collision course as well. The role of the archivist in a traditional archive may be different from the role of an archivist in a community archive, and so we'll just touch on some of those contrasts. Okay, so the first collision point that we'll talk about is personal archives, which is something that the Douglas article talked about quite a bit. So she offers some descriptions of personal archives, excuse me, talks about how in a lot of ways personal archives have been sidelined in archival theory and in archival programs. But she argues that there is a lot of value in preserving the personal archives of individuals as opposed to just the organizational records that archives have traditionally focused on. So she describes them as being subjective, idiosyncratic, emotional, and contemporary, as opposed to kind of more pragmatic and homogeneous records that you might find in organizational archives. And Douglas describes an impulse to tame and destroy the wilderness area of personal record keeping, to sort of exclude this emotion and this subjectivity and this idiosyncratic nature. And I think that you can connect this to some of the ideas of postmodernism and how archives shape memory that we've talked about. If you are eliminating the type of record that documents a more personal perspective, a perspective that might not be sort of coded in the language and norms of organizations, which might be dominant in culture and society, then you really are losing a lot of perspectives in archives and in society that might run counter to the perspective of an organization. And especially if these sort of more personal perspectives run counter to the narratives that organizations maintain, whether it's just to, whether that's just because of a desire to conduct business in a certain way, whether that's a desire to maintain power in society, this exclusion of personal archives can support the creation of the meta-narratives that, as we've discussed, postmodernism really works against. And so Douglas talks about how the inclusion of personal archives expands the notion of the record due to the variability in the records that comprise them. So again, we talked a little bit about personal archives in 650, but really you can have everything under the sun in personal archives. And again, this just provides a more varied perspective than organizational archives might have, as well as a more varied format of record. So organizations may choose to communicate information about themselves in very strict and structured ways, and personal archives can be a lot more varied and again, idiosyncratic. It's also interesting to consider what records have and haven't been considered personal archives in the past, according to the archival profession. And this is something that the Douglas article comments on. Rather than considering records to be personal only if they have been created by individuals, the Douglas article argues that the concept of personal archives, or the definition of personal archives, really ought to be expanded so that it includes organizational records, which may have had some impact on people represented in those records. So typically, archival thought has been if these records were created by this organization, then those are organizational records, no matter what connections those records might have with individuals. And we've all been touched or represented in organizational records. It's just kind of inevitability of being a person. You have some kind of records attached to you. And the Douglas article would argue that since those records, again, document your life or impact your life in some way, whether it's how the records are written, how information about you is communicated, about how those records are accessed and by whom, those ought to be considered personal archives as well. And again, this goes against a lot of traditional archival thought, which again really focuses on the idea of provenance, and there's sort of one creator, and they get to determine to a great extent how records are accessed, how information is communicated, and so on. And by giving people represented in records, or by reconsidering the scope of personal records and considering the organizational records really are personal as well, since they do impact and represent individuals, that can give the people represented in those records a sense of ownership of those records, even though, again, they might be created and used by an organization as opposed to the person themselves. And along with this concept of ownership of records, ideally, there's some shift in power as well. And the idea that if we consider organizational records to be part of a person's personal archives, then that person ought to have some say in, again, how those records are accessed and how the information contained in them is used and so on. So you can argue that because of this shift in power, this reconception of personal archives to include records created by individuals and records created by institutions about people is more community-centric, because it's one that allows the concern and well-being of individuals represented in records to be taken into account and represented in record-keeping policies surrounding those records. On page 271 in the Douglas article, there's some discussion about some of the dangers of not considering organizational records to be part of a person's personal archive. So the article talks about how this can result in a lack of privacy due to a lack of control over access. It could result in exposure and surveillance by the police, by other authorities. And, obviously these are two things that can put people in a pretty powerless situation. And again, sort of expanding this conception of personal archives and what records are considered a part of a personal archives can have some of the shifts in power that, as we've discussed, community archives are created and maintained to address. It's also important to consider, as the Douglas article notes on page 271, that oftentimes institutional records might be the only records about a person or about a community still exist. So if archives have in the past excluded personal archives, and especially personal archives from community groups that were thought of as not being worthy of preservation, then it might be that these institutional or organizational records are the only ones that exist. And so they may serve as the only representation of a person or of a community that is available to researchers and to the community itself. So that really heightens the need for this reconception of personal archives to take place, so that community members have some control over what may be the only sort of broadly available perspective about a community that exists. And so this discussion about individuals having some control over records and power over records extends to some notions of record ownership and who owns records. In the Zavala article for this week, the authors talk about some of the post-custodial practices that they employ in order to share power with community members. So instances where the archives will borrow records and scan them or make copies of them and then return the records to the individuals that the records came from. Situations where there was a lot of consultation with community members over record keeping decisions surrounding the records. And there are some additional examples of this in the Carter and Selly articles that we read for this week as well. And this really differs from how archives have viewed record ownership in the past. So, you know, with archives, the idea is if we gain legal custody of these records, they're pretty much ours to do with as we like. You know, we own these records, so we have the power to dictate what happens to them. And in a more sort of community-centric conception of ownership, which the Zavala article provides some examples of, it's more of a shared custody sort of arrangement. The archives may have control over the records to a certain extent, but they are regularly consulting with community members in order to navigate different record keeping decisions surrounding the records. You know, maybe even how the records are described, how the records are accessed, how they're preserved, and so on. And the Zavala article suggests that this approach has been pretty successful. So archives have been able to acquire records or preserve records that they wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And again, this is a reconsideration of a pretty fundamental aspect of archiving that can help shift power from archives to community members represented in archives. So again, there's a strong connection to the idea of community-centric archiving that we've talked about in this course. And so you can connect this to more of a stewardship relationship as opposed to just straight ownership. So in a situation in which an institution creates records, and there's a community documented within that institution, and it's more of a collaboration. It's more of an equal partnership as opposed to an institution creating records or an institution documenting records that is more one-sided. And where it's an archive or an institution that creates records that has sole power over record keeping decisions surrounding those records. So, you know, a lot of people fundamentally value the idea of ownership. So I own this, so I get to make the decisions surrounding what happens to these records. And, you know, obviously that places all the power in one person and not in another. Another way that community archives may operate in a way that challenges traditional archival concepts is by collecting records that have been traditionally excluded from archives. And there are some examples of this in the Anderson article that we read when we discussed postmodernism. So some of the sort of rigid definitions that archives have used to determine what is and what isn't a record. So those are discussions that we could tie into this concept as well. And then you could also look at social media records, which is the focus of the Welt article. And also the idea of what types of communities or groups have been documented by archives. So the Welt article talks a lot about documenting activist groups. And the importance of collecting social media, as the Welt article notes on page 113, is that it may document media or perspectives that challenge meta-narratives crafted by the conventional media. So oftentimes social media posts can be more localized, more intimate, for a lack of a better word, more nuanced. And this can serve as, again, a counter narrative to media reports or perspectives contained in archives, which may be more sort of homogenous and I guess easily digestible by people because of their sort of simplistic meta-narrative structure or characteristics. And then when you think about a shift to documenting activist groups, you know, oftentimes activist groups can behave or communicate their beliefs, their desires, their needs. And these beliefs and desires and needs and communications can run counter to a lot of people containing power in society. You know, activism, as we've discussed before, really exists to redirect power, and oftentimes that comes at the stake of people who are in power presently. So making sure to document activist groups and make sure that their perspectives and their histories are included in archives can serve as an additional check and power. So you can connect these first two, shift to collecting social media, and we can include other types of records as well, again, to look back to the Anderson article, and documenting activist groups as being community-centric, because these records may well document the needs and concerns and issues of well-being surrounding community members. And that's certainly something that community-centric archiving is supportive of. As I have noted here, and as the Velt article also discusses, assuming that these first two take place, there really is a need to shift ethical standards to compensate for the inclusion of social media and other types of records, and to incorporate the documentation of activist groups. So the Velt article talks about the need to protect community members, and the author gives an example of police records in Canada of the LGBTQ community. So the police were using records about the LGBTQ community to surveil them. And the overall need to balance privacy and access, which is a pretty standard balance in the archives profession, but it's one that becomes especially important when records may be related to the experiences of marginalized communities, or the actions done by marginalized communities to gain power in society. So you just can't collect records which may be more sensitive, more culturally valuable to a community, or records that document activist actions taken by a community, and not think more carefully about what the ultimate purpose of those records are. And there really is a need to reevaluate the record keeping policies surrounding the use of these records by individuals that are sort of outside of those that are a part of an activist group, or those that are represented in social media records, or whatever types of records archives expand the notion of a record in order to include in their archives. Another way that community archives may challenge traditional archival concepts is by focusing on identity construction. And this is something that the Feng article talks about, the possibility of archives moving from a heritage resource serving the academic elite to becoming a social foundation of identity and justice. And traditionally, archives have been resources for the academic elite. So they've documented the elites in public, and they have served the elites in public as well. It's been kind of a incestuous little relationship going on. And the Feng article discusses about how if archives are more conscious of the role that they play in, or could play in, helping members of society develop their identity, their sort of sense of who am I, which group do I belong to, then they can have a lot of positive value in society. And you can look at these aspects of identity. So who am I, which group do I belong to, and correlate them pretty well with representational belonging, which is something that we'll touch on in just a little bit. So it really is an interesting discussion of why archives exist. Why do archives exist in the first place? Is it to, is it just to serve a sort of small subset of society, or should archives be institutions that help people, especially people in communities who, for whatever reason, may not have a strong sense of identity? Maybe their history has been ignored or suppressed in the past. Should archives be a force that helps people connect with their heritage and connect with their identity? So, do archives want to be collectors of records that have evidential value, or do they want to be cultural and social resources that support the identities of the communities? And the answer to this is really going to dictate how or if archives incorporate some of the non-traditional practices that we've talked about in this lecture. Are archives going to reconsider the scope of personal archives? Are they going to have a more evolved view on the creation and ownership of records? Are they going to be, more open to which types of records are supported and who is documented in archives and who is excluded? If the answer to these three questions is yes, then archives are in a better position to be more supportive of identity formation and construction in society. If the answer to these questions is no, then it's more likely that archives are just going to kind of remain, bastions of information to the elite that have really a one-sided understanding of power in society and who should have control over history and over record-keeping decisions surrounding records and archives. And I feel strongly that for a archive to be a true community archive, then they do need to address some of these more evolved aspects or notions of record keeping. So if they want to be a community-centric archive, if they want to be an archive that has the community's interests, needs, and well-being central to its mission, if they want to be an archive where community records and materials are understood in their originating context, if they want to be archives that document community complexity and flux, then they really need to be more open to thinking about things like personal archives and post-custodial archiving and stewardship as opposed to ownership, and having a broader view of what is and isn't a record. And I feel like these are all important things for community archives to do as well. So if you want to be a community archive that truly represents a particular community, then you need to be supportive of a community's identity. That's a really strong part of why community archives exist, as we've talked about in this course. You do need to have the ability or the willingness to connect personal records with organizational records and realize that organizational records can be personal as well. You do need to have more of a stewardship relationship with the people represented in your community archive, as opposed to a situation where you're just kind of extracting the records from the community and the community has no way to participate in record keeping decisions surrounding those records. So, when you talk about stewardship, you talk about participation. And as we've talked about before, and as we'll talk about in greater detail later on this semester, participation is an essential part of community archives. If there isn't community participation, then it's not a community archive. And this notion of ownership versus stewardship is really essential towards a willingness to make that participation happen. And you could really argue that a lack of these evolved views of archiving can create the conditions that result in community archives being created in the first place. So community archives exist because traditionally archives haven't thought of supporting a community's identity as being a reason for an archive's existence. Community archives exist because archives have been pretty exclusionary when it comes to the types of records that it collects and the people that are documented or not documented in archives. Community archives exist because archives have traditionally rejected the idea of having a stewardship relationship with people represented in their records. Community archives exist because there has been a strict separation between personal and organizational records, and there really hasn't been in archives a representation of the idea that organizational archives have a personal element to them as well, and that should be respected and brought into archival practice. So last but not least, we'll talk about the role of the archivist in community archives. And, as I just talked about, community participation is so important. And making sure that community members have the ability and even the willingness to participate in record keeping decisions surrounding records within an archive. Again, not something that has been traditionally thought of as being a regular practice of traditional archives or a regular responsibility or action that traditional archives have been engaged in. Next, we have facilitate community access. So just making records accessible to the community, making sure that records that have been excluded from traditional archives are available to community members, maybe even making sure that records that are in organizations that have documented their community are available to the community as well. So again, kind of bridging the gap between personal and organizational records, maybe even facilitating community access to records in other archives that document a particular community. So it doesn't necessarily have to be just access to records in the community archive itself, but in the sort of broader web of information about a community that may exist in governmental organizations or other archives. An important one is facilitating community protection. So behaving in a way that protects the community and doesn't create a situation in which the community or information about the community might be exploited. Whether that's by the media or other people outside of the community. Another important one is facilitate identity formation. So again, something that archives haven't traditionally thought of as being a responsibility or an obligation of archives. As I just mentioned, a lot of the reason why community archives exist is because a lot of different factors have led to difficulty in members of particular communities having a sense of who I am, who do I belong with? So again, things that are represented in the ideas of representational belonging that we've talked about in this course. And if community archives and community archivists don't facilitate this sense of identity formation, then they really are falling short of the reasons why a community archive may exist in the first place. And I think another, this last one here is really important. So don't dictate. You need to have an open community participation process. You need to have the ability for community members to give feedback on record keeping decisions surrounding records. If it's a community archive where, you know, there's one person or maybe only a couple of people that are making all the decisions about how the community operates and sort of who's represented in the archive, who has access to the archive, then that really perpetuates a lot of the centralization of power that can make people feel, you know, disenfranchised and marginalized, and you know, like they don't have a sense of agency or belonging or power. And you know, that's really the last thing that archives should be doing, because again, all these things often lead to the creation of community archives in the first place. So you don't want to perpetuate the conditions that resulted in your community archive being created. You don't want to sort of continue the oppression and sense of or a lack of a sense of belonging that your community members have felt in the past. You know, if you say we're doing this to help you, but what you're doing actually kind of continues to hurt and marginalize people, then you know, that's certainly not an ideal situation, and one that really goes against the idea of community-centric archiving. Okay, so we'll go ahead and call it a wrap there. I hope that this lecture has helped contextualize some of our readings for this week. I hope it's also been a good review of some of the things that we've talked about in the past. That's always good, and I hope that it has helped you think more about what kind of archivist you want to be in the future, and what sort of view on records and power within archives you want to work towards when you are an archivist in a mainstream archives. And hopefully it leads you to think about ways in which you might be able to shift the practices of the archive that you work at, so that it is more community centric, and so that it serves as more of a challenge to the ways in which more traditional or mainstream archives have practiced in the past and continue to operate today. So thank you for listening. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and enjoy the rest of your day.